So as you can see, Steven's representing Japan with a nice Japanese background. How is it over there, Steven, at the moment?
It's okay where I am. I mean, it's the rainy season, so it's a bit gray and drizzly and humid, but not so bad where I'm at. I'm on top of a mountain in Nagano. So my colleagues back in Kyoto, I think, are sweating away in their apartments, I'm
Yeah,
sure.
but
Yeah,
it gets to about 40 in there, doesn't it? And really humid.
yeah, yeah. No escape, even at night.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So we just got Ludivine joining us now. Hi, Ludivine.
Hello. Oh,
Hello. Can
wait.
only see a blank screen. Where are you?
I know. I have a problem with one webcam, so I need to plug in the external one. Just give me a second.
No worries.
I should appear.
There you
Yes.
go.
Hello. Yeah. Technology for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. The camera on the webcam on the laptop has decided to die, basically.
Oh, really?
Oh,
So yeah. So I have an external one, so just on top of it.
Shows maybe how many webinars and meetings you've had to go to online since
right.
COVID.
None, absolutely none.
Okay, well, we just wait another minute for some more people to arrive. As I was saying before, feel free to keep your cameras off because we're recording. We've also got the chat box, so as the presentations are going on, feel free to put your questions in there. I'd also invite Steven and Ludivine to ask each other questions if you are particularly interested.
Sure.
Yeah, so put one in the chat box if you want.
Great.
Yeah. Sounds good.
There you go.
Do you want me to turn off my camera as well during?
Only if you want to. It's fine
Yeah.
to keep it on, and then if you just use your share screen to share your slides after Steven.
Okay. Yeah.
Brilliant. Great. So just to those of you who are new to the CCRI, just maybe a bit of background about us. We're the Countryside and Community Research Institute based in the southwest of the UK. And we do research, primarily social science research on food systems. We look at farmer behaviour, consumer behaviour, rural to urban linkages and food systems. We also work on a variety of scales, so national, European and international. So we've been doing some work with Steven at the Research Institute for Humanities and Nature over in Kyoto, Japan, which is why he's joining us today. And I think we might have also done a bit of work with Ludivine from Cardiff. We've certainly done work with Cardiff University. We've got networks over there as well. So yeah, we work on different scales. So just going to wait a few more minutes. People are still coming in. And yeah, again, the chat box is on the right if you want to use that for questions throughout. How's it over where you are, Ludivine? You said it was really hot this morning. Is it still super hot?
Yeah, well, it's Cardiff, right?
Yeah,
it's so hot in Cardiff always. No, maybe the hottest day of the year in most parts of the UK today. So
yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yesterday was 30, and then they're forecasting like 31, 32 for today. So I'm like,
yeah, it's really strange times over here.
Yeah.
We've had drought really for the last few months, so I think our farmers are feeling the effects of that at the moment, and they had a really wet winter as well, so a bit of a double whammy for them, as well as COVID.
Indeed, and then, but there were also flash floods at the weekend, last weekend, and that was pretty bad in Wales, and some parts of Wales actually flooded.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess
So,
the capacity for the soil to hold that water is kind of it's been decreased with how dry it's got.
Yeah.
I think we might have some more coming this weekend as well.
I haven't looked. Oh, yes, they're forecasting thunderstorm for this evening. Yes, true.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's super humid over here as well, Stephen. You can sympathize with your Kyoto colleagues, definitely.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes, it's no fun. But we have had, I think, on the whole, a pretty mild rainy season compared to seasons past. So it's a bit dry over here as well. Normally it's just a month worth of gray rain all the time, you know, but it's a little bit nicer.
Yeah, it's interesting how we look forward to summer with the sunshine, and over there it's quite a different story.
Yeah.
All right, I think we've got most people in the room now, so I'll just introduce our speakers and just to let you know that we are recording from this point on, so if you want to keep your cameras off, if you have issues with your face being shared online, then please keep it off. We will be posting this on our YouTube channel afterwards. And yeah, as Theo's just posted, Q&As in the chat box, please, as the presentations go on. So our first speaker is Steven McGreevy from the Research Institute of Humanity and Nature in Kyoto. So he's going to be talking a little bit today about how Japan has been coping with COVID-19 and perhaps specifically on veg box schemes. We did a bit of a collaboration a couple of months ago just to look at synchronizing some questions between how veg box schemes have been coping during that time. And then we've got Ludivine Petetin, I think that's the right way to say it, from Cardiff University, who's going to be talking about Brexit and food policy and food democracy and citizenship. So looking forward to both of these. I think there'll be some interesting synergies between the two, actually. So it'll be interesting to see maybe some cross-comparison questions as well, if you have those. Great. So I'm going to hand over to you, Stephen, if you could start sharing your slides.
Sure. Great, thank you. Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
All right, fantastic. So yes, good evening, good afternoon, I guess, for most of you. My name is Steven McGreevy, and as Jasmine was saying, I'm at the Research Institute for Humanity and Nature based in Kyoto, Japan. I'm part of a project there called the FEAST Project that looks at sustainable food and agricultural transitions in Asia. And this COVID pandemic has sort of brought a new sense of urgency around finding time and sort of manpower to take a look at a quick survey around the farmer situation here in Japan and how COVID affected their livelihoods and their daily lives. But before I get into that, you know, there's a bit of material I need to go over just to sort of explain where Japan was in terms of the COVID experience here. Comparatively, Japan did pretty well to some of the other countries around the world. You can see after the kind of peak of cases in April and in May, there was a drastic decline, and we're kind of still hovering around about 50 new cases or so every day in Tokyo, but relatively low mortality rates in the country. For many, the biggest sort of issue around coronavirus was having to, of course, have a bit of a lockdown. There was a national emergency declared, but the Prime Minister was, one of his sort of famous moves was to send cloth masks to everyone, which were kind of criticized because they weren't very useful. There was kind of quickly a movement began around how to remake the government mask into something a little bit more useful and usable over the long term. But this was kind of one of the biggest scandals that sort of took place during the pandemic. Of course, a lot of things did change for people. A lot more folks, of course, didn't go to work and they started teleworking. There's some surveys that showed that there were a number of benefits to telework. In this survey here of about 1,000 people in the Tokyo area, it meant that there was a lot less stress due to commuting. Of course, Tokyo subway system is kind of famous for having sort of packed rush hours. And of course, a lot less time spent in meetings and people having more energy and more time with their families. And actually, another article came out the other day that that basically said that more folks want to continue telework after the pandemic. So this would signify something big if the sort of work culture could be modified through the pandemic. Of course, shopping was shut down for the most part. People stayed at home and turned to delivery services. There was a big increase in home delivery of food. The home delivery sector may reach about $3 billion US dollars here by the end of the year. And also this was a good thing for a lot of consumer cooperatives. There was many more orders from members in co-ops. In this survey of about 10 co-ops, they said that purchasing was up 54%. A lot more people were buying frozen foods, things that would last, and many people refrained from going out to shop. At the same time, there was a lot more folks that were interested in becoming members of consumer co-ops. So that was something that happened as well. But if you look at where the pandemic hit the hardest, it was mainly in urban places. And any place in a rural area was kind of cautiously taking a look at what was going to happen, but they were largely unaffected by the number of cases, and there was very few clusters in rural places. And so we asked the question, what about the farmers? And how did the COVID pandemic sort of disturb their everyday operations? One of the questions we were thinking about was, do these small-scale alternative farmers have greater degree of resiliency in the face of these kinds of disturbances? We looked at sales distribution, management on farm, impact on their daily lives, and distributed through the survey through online farmer networks. It ran for about a month. We only had about 100 or so that answered the survey, but this is part of a bigger effort to try to compare cross-country in a number of different places in Asia, Europe, and in South America, actually. So just to take a look at who answered the survey, who are the farmers that were participating, we had a nice, a bit of a range of different types of farming methods represented. There was a majority of uncertified organic. That's not very unique to the situation around organic. There are many, many uncertified organic farmers, as the certification process is a little bit laborsome and costly. But we did have some conventional farmers and reduced pesticide farmers, which we call eco farmers over here. But mainly vegetable farmers and rice farmers, few that were having orchards and livestock. If you take a look at the management type, many farms were family-run farms. About 42% were part-time. And then also very small farms. In Japan, over 3/4 or so were under 3 hectares, and that's also fairly common. We looked at the kinds of sales channels that the farms normally used. We captured a nice percentage of farms that use direct sales to customers, sort of box schemes, online sales, sort of CSA scene. Also those that ship direct to farmer stands or Michi no Eki, various kind of Marche or things of this nature. And also there was a large degree of folks that did direct sales to independent businesses or restaurants as well. In terms of how much money or economically well off some of these farms are, the vast majority make less than, or I should say half, the majority of the farms make less than, I would say 22,500 British pounds. I try to convert the yen over to pounds to make more sense. That's fairly common. I mean, the majority of farmers, if you take a look on the right, this is data from the ministry that shows over 3/4 of farms making that amount or less. So what kind of impact did the pandemic have? We didn't see major change really to many of the sales channels and distribution channels, except for the farmers markets and the marches, which were reduced by about 80%. Of course, there were no farmers markets; they were all canceled. Those kinds of things were, all those sorts of events were essentially canceled. And we only saw a bit of an increase in online direct sales to customers, so sort of new CSA members or something like to that effect, which was quite different than I think what we saw in the case of the UK through Jasmine's research there as well. But also what was interesting is that for all the farms, the farmers that were surveyed were much more concerned with health and schooling and the sort of impact on daily life than they were for the impact on agricultural issues. Both of these sort of findings we found so far are different from the case in Italy. Italy, which was hit pretty hard, saw much more very different changes into the sort of sales routes. There was an increase in direct sales, but of course a massive decrease in like direct sales to restaurants, etc. And in Italy as well, they were much more concerned about their farm and the agricultural issues around that than they were of sort of daily life issues. But we did find some differences between the kinds of farmers. Organic farmers were significantly less concerned about how the pandemic would affect product sales, on-farm management, and daily life than conventional farmers, which suggests that they were sort of more autonomous or more secure in their sales routes from members, etc. And compared to last year, they were making a little bit more money, at least non-certified organic farmers were, than were other types of farms. But we did compare, for example, farm size or income level, or folks that immigrated versus those that were more established, and there was no really significant difference. So there's not a lot to say really about how the pandemic impacted farmers. There were a few anecdotal responses about people feeling safe because they're working outside, so they're not very worried. Maybe they are eating organic food and boosted their immune system. Folks did mention that they feel like there is or will be more demand for CSA type of operations, and COVID may present an opportunity to change the food system for the better. Some other sort of studies in Japan did find that some producers were more affected than others, and we just simply didn't capture some of these effects. One issue was around foreign agricultural labor, so folks that come in on a training program. There's not too many, but that whole program essentially was suspended. But some farms that did have direct sales to schools, for example, hotels, restaurants, flower farmers that produce flowers for events like Mother's Day, they suffered fairly significantly. And of course, there was a reduction in tourism. I found this online. I thought it was kind of interesting. This is a website that shows different farmers that you can buy directly from. And this is a special selection of farmers that have essentially had trouble with the coronavirus and been unable to sell certain products, and you can buy them at sort of a discount or essentially to help reduce food loss and help these farmers get through this tough economic time. So our survey essentially didn't capture some of these cases. But in the sort of more long-term picture here, what does this all mean for sustainability for food and agriculture in the countryside? There's a few other crises that Japan is sort of facing that are also just as significant as COVID. Of of course, the shrinking population. Japan is a super aged society. In 45 years, over 40%, nearly 40% of the population will be aged 65 or older. And there's certain areas in rural places that will simply go extinct. Folks will no longer live in these areas. And so this has massive, of course, implications for agriculture. Yeah, there's a sort of interesting, some interesting terms that have developed to sort of signify the degrees of abandonment that you can find over here. Marginalized hamlet, the third one from the top, is the one that's often used, Genkai Shurak. And these, of course, are on the rise. So the typical family farm in Japan is producing rice and vegetables. They're pluriactive, meaning they get most of their income off farm. They have dispersed plots that are spread around in their village. They also are usually using the farmers' cooperatives called the JA to sell any produce that they use for the market, but also to access inputs and technology. Probably don't have a successor. They're very reluctant to sell land, which is a big issue. There's issues around family graves or sort of obligations to ancestors. So people are quite reluctant to sell, but when they pass away, some of those lands now are being accumulated or aggregated into different land banks to sort of facilitate new farmers or other people that want to farm to take up those sites. And so in general, the agricultural situation in Japan is not looking very positive after World War II. Population, area under cultivation, working core workers in agriculture has all gone down, and the average age of farmers has gone way up. So this, of course, comes into or is related back to issues around self-sufficiency. This is a bit old, this data, but it shows a nice comparison with other countries. By a calorie base, which means domestic production to sort of provide calories for domestic consumption, Japan is around 40%. I think the most latest figure is around 37%, which is kind of precarious. So essentially, could COVID and sort of initiate or kind of catalyze some changes to the countryside or to agriculture in general? And I think there may be, and there's some signs for more migrants coming to rural places and living if telework essentially dismantles work culture. There may be a sort of signs that small farmers or folks that are sort of want to engage in more agrarian lifestyles can have a chance to do that. They may have the markets to use that through cooperatives and CSAs, for example. And this sort of notion of decentralizing the society, of moving away from the sort of urban concentrated way in which folks are distributed is a bigger sort of, it's a potential in the future. So very quickly, I'll go through some of these things. There's another survey that took place this last month, saw a massive increase, 23% increase in folks that say they want to live in the countryside in the future. This was a survey in Tokyo. Many people pointed to the risks of living in urban environments. And of course, telework opens up the potential for people to move, not just in the peri-urban areas, but places a little bit further into the countryside. And there's a lot of different migration sort of patterns or ways in which people can sort of lead dual lives in a way. This notion of an O-turn is very new to me. It's kind of emerged from these discussions around post-COVID life, but it would essentially be people with a home in the city and outside the city and moving through back and forth between these homes. There's other sort of patterns out there. This is kind of unique to Japan, but they're kind of interesting. There's a interesting example of folks working in the country or working in the city, but also doing jobs remotely for rural places, I should say. Side jobs for hometowns was something that emerged from the crisis. And more folks may practice sort of hybridized sort of agrarian lifestyles like Han no Han X, which is half farming, half something else. For cooperatives, as I said, they really found, they really had a nice uptick in members and membership and orders. For many cooperatives, or certain cooperatives, I should say, in certain places, the membership was going down before COVID. So this is an opportunity for small scale farmers. And then in general here, I just want to mention that this idea of where the society at large could go, there could be a much more dispersed population in rural places, kind of relying on urban capital or natural capital versus sort of produced capital. There's a couple studies that are out to look at this, and I'll skip these. And I'll just end here, but there was an interesting study that took place 3 years ago now, that looked at, used an AI, an artificial intelligence, to analyze different sort of factors going forward for Japan. And they gave a window of about 8 to 10 years before Japan would essentially be locked into a urban, dense sort of future. And so COVID has sort of pushed the envelope a bit and shown that perhaps decentralization is still an option if there are policies to support it. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Stephen. That was really interesting. Good overview of Japan. And Ludivine, could I ask you to share your slides, please?
Let me just...
and do keep the questions coming for Stephen as you're kind of mulling that over, and then also for Ludivine as she's talking as well. And we'll do about 20-25 minutes of questions at the end. So over to you, Ludivine. I can see your screen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's great that you can see my screen. Can you see me as well? Okay, yeah?
Yeah.
So thank you very much first for the invitation. I really appreciate it. I'm, as mentioned, I'm based in Cardiff, law school. So I'm sorry, as a lawyer, I don't have that many pictures, or as many pictures as Stephen. I do apologize. So I'm also based at the Wales Governance Centre at Cardiff University, which is focusing on Wales research. And I'm also a member of the Brexit and Environment Network, which is funded by the ESRC. So I'm going to discuss today so a little bit about food democracy, COVID-19 and Brexit. And basically my talk is based on a journal article that I published a couple of months ago. And I have the reference later on in the presentation. So I'm basically going to focus on 3 points. So first of all, I'm going to focus on food security and trade during the pandemic. Then I will talk about multi-level food governance and food democracy. And then I will look at what, like Stephen did a bit, at opportunities and ways forward after COVID and Brexit. I'm interested in that international trade, so this is where it starts from here. But it's important to remember that international trade feeds 1 in 6 people on the planet. So we are talking 1.3 billion people actually rely on agri-food products being traded worldwide. And of course, with the pandemic has had an impact on international trade. But of course, what is also traded is products like fertilizers. And with the main hub for the production of fertilizers being China, and the closure of production in China combined with the closures of borders worldwide has had an impact on how much is produced, how much is traded, which then will have an impact on yields and harvest over the next few months. So this is something to bear in mind. And of course, what I wanted to highlight is how international trade and agriculture share similar traits, and how they are sensitive to certain shocks, whether that's health, whether that's economic shocks, and most importantly, they are impacted by political decisions. for lockdown or policies or financial support, which is what I will come back to in a second. So what COVID-19 has done in terms of global agri-food trade is that, as we all know, borders started to shut. But what has happened is that a lot of the countries closed their internal borders and prevented agricultural exports. So, for instance, Russia banned exports of wheat, Vietnam banned exports of rice. And of course, this will have an impact on global food availability. Another impact with COVID-19 is that some states decided to increase their tariffs for some products that would come into their country, simply because they wanted to protect their national farmers. And other barriers to trade have developed in order to increase food safety, in particular in relation to animal health, is the increase of SPS measures. So increase in controls at the border, inspections, etc. So this, of course, is impacting on trade. Conversely, what has happened is that some states have actually hoarded food. So, for instance, the Philippines hoarded rice, and Egypt and Saudi Arabia grabbed all the wheat they could, and this in order to feed their population. So, what we see either with excess buying or countries that are restricting export is that they want to make sure that their population have enough food to eat, but also they want to maintain to avoid civil unrest. And a key point with global agri-food trade is that, of course, we have seen in the news how sheep have been restricted, and that impacted on trade. We also saw the issues around trucks, and that is important. But also, what is key when you think about agri-food trade is everything that is put into aircrafts, and 90% of passenger flights actually carry cargo, especially fresh fruits and vegetables, which again creates worries that we could be facing a global food crisis. And for the reasons that I've mentioned in relation to lack of fertilizers, closing of borders, we also need to bear in mind the lockdowns, the looming economic crisis that the world is facing. And of course, what we have seen in a lot of countries around the world is disruptions, food shortages due to this just-in-time supply chain that we have in place, where we often only have 1 to 2 weeks, of supply before it runs out. And another issue facing a global food crisis is, of course, the issue on farmers or agricultural workers facing illnesses. And of course, it needs, if farmers were unable to plant, this will have an impact on their harvest. So this is important to bear that in mind. However, on the positive side, is that major food staples like maize and wheat are actually doing very well. There is sufficient availability of it. However, prices have gone up. Another issue that some of you may have seen in your respective countries is that a lot of meat and food processing plants have had to shut down due to COVID-19. So, for instance, the Two Sisters plant in Llangefni in Wales, so that's on Anglesey, has had to close because 200 of their staff actually tested positive to COVID-19. They have about 500 staff there. Similarly, in Germany, the Tony's abattoirs have had to close, and because of the number of COVID-19 cases they've had, so they've had 1,500 staff affected with COVID-19 out of 6,000 members of staff that they have, and this has led the lander of North Westphalia in Germany to actually be placed under quarantine for the foreseeable future. So it's still around, and we can see still that this is impacting on the food chain. Now, moving on to the more food democracy side, and seeing the issues around the agri-food system, is that COVID-19 is showing how often the farmer depends on the rest of the food supply chain. So often the farmer feels powerless to impact on the food system as a whole because of those big corporations, this big food, this industrial food system that we have in place. And what we have is really, really interesting dichotomy here. On one side, a very weak position of the farmer against big supermarket chains. And whilst they produce what we need or what supermarkets need and the rest of the food supply chain need in order to produce agri-food products. However, there is a clear symmetries in bargaining power, and this imbalance is really really showing in the agri-food supply chain, and it shows really the vulnerability of farmers in commercial relationships, and of course, most importantly, the economic dependence of farmers on the rest of the supply chain. So what I had been working on before I'm going to say Brexit. So I worked a lot on multi-level food governance and food democracy pre-2016, and then coming up to the referendum, I started to do more work around Brexit. Which took me away from food democracy, multi-level food governance. But then the pandemic has brought me back to something I'm really passionate about. So here, I think what COVID-19 is showing is how farmers can take advantage of what they produce to their benefit. And one of the key frameworks for me that I've found very useful to do this is food democracy, also called food citizenship, because I find it more interesting than, for instance, the concept of food sovereignty, because food sovereignty is often about looking inwards, looking at self-sufficiency. And food democracy does a little bit of that, but it's also about trade, so it's also about local and international. What I also find really important in food democracy is that it focuses on decency and social justice, focusing on increased wages to farmers and how they can get a better livelihood out of what they produce. So So going back to my 2016 research that I've reused in my article, which I published a couple of months ago, was that I identified 4 critical characteristics of food democracy. The first one really is shown at in many countries around the world, where citizens have been more involved into wanting to know where their food comes from. And this is really important. This is really key. And this is shown also how box schemes, veg schemes have really expanded in the UK and worldwide, as Stephen mentioned. What is also important with food democracy is not only to have a top-down approach, which is usually what we have, but a bottom-up approach, where we have farmers actually feeding into what local authorities do, feeding into their decision-making process that then feeds into the national decision-making process. And most importantly, in relation to the third point, is how farmers can improve their livelihoods and their opportunities. And here with COVID-19, there are a few opportunities that also are rising out of Brexit. And the two I wanted to mention is diversification of what farmers do, to potentially include more packaging on the farm, processing on the farm, etc. And something that is quite strong in Japan, following what Stephen said, is cooperatives. It's not something that is really strong in the UK, and this is something that, you know, would really improve the status and the strength of farmers. Last but not least, of course, it's also food democracy is about putting faith and trust in the food system, and we see with, you know, this appeal towards veg box, towards local butchers. It has been all over Wales like this, and the rest of the UK, how important it is to put faith into the agri-food system. So now, and you know, just very briefly on Brexit. Well, negotiations are, let's say, at a standstill. It seems like we won't get an extension to the transition period that we are having, because the deadline to ask for an extension is the 1st of July, and now we're the 25th, I believe. So I don't think it's going to happen. And one of the key issues that remains between the UK and the EU thinking about agri-food is, of course, the issue around regulatory alignment and, you know, environmental and animal welfare standards, and how these are going to evolve, you know, over the next few months of the negotiations. And of course, to be again, sorry, negative here, we can't stop talking about a no deal. No deal remains a possibility due to the standstill in the negotiations. So this is something to bear in mind. However, and more positively, what I think is really interesting is to think about the bigger picture and the vision that we want for British farming and also agriculture more widely. And what we have seen in the UK with the Ag Bill, and I know that the Ag Bill is mostly for England, is the focus on financial support to farmers. And this is where here we see that with the pandemic and also a wider issues around rural economy, rural countryside, that the bill is no longer fit for purpose, even before it actually becomes law. You know, it doesn't say what we want UK agriculture to look like. Do we want agroecology, net zero? Does it need to build in green recovery? At the moment, the focus is on financially supporting farmers, which is really important, but we should think about what we want British agriculture to look like. What's also important, and that what is missing in all this when you think about agriculture, is that we need to think about synergies between agri-food, well, agriculture, because often food is out of the picture, and other public policies, and in particular trade. So what we see is discussion on trade, discussion on food, discussion on agriculture, discussion on health, when you think about nutrition, but we don't think about these holistically. And this is why I think food democracy could be one of the ways forward, where, you know, it's about the whole of the agri-food system. It's thinking about local food production to increase food and self-sufficiency, but also working with longer and international supply chains to increase resilience. To increase resilience. And my conclusion is basically what I've just said, and I think I've overrun. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ludivine. That was great and very comprehensive. Thank you. So we've got a few questions. Stephen, if I could ask you to turn your microphone on for any questions. And Theo is been collecting those questions. So Theo, do you want to fire ahead with asking Stephen first?
Thank you. Yes, just coming online. Can you hear me? Yeah, great.
No problem.
All right, Stephen, so the first question will be for you. Do you think you could expand a bit more on where the farmers you surveyed were located, whether they were close to urban areas or far away from towns, and how it impacted the kind of markets they had access to during coronavirus? Right,
no, that's a good question. So we didn't ask if they were located in predominantly urban or predominantly rural. We just asked them which prefecture. At the time when we were putting the survey together, we thought that certain prefectures may have be impacted more by COVID, and so that we could sort of link, you know, clusters and stuff in certain places and see if that would happen. But so we don't really know, you know, how deeply rural some places, some farmers were located, and if people were doing urban farming, for example. But in terms of available markets, I can say that, so for example, a big chunk of the folks that we did capture were based in Kyoto, around in the Kyoto area, around the where our institute is based. So, for example, in Kyoto, I mean, they have access to any number of kind of options. Of course, the standard Japan agricultural corporations, or cooperatives, I should say, to push their products forward. But then there's all these sort of direct sales to customers or to restaurants, or institutional contracts to schools or hospitals, and all these kinds of things as well. But I don't think, unless there was places that are quite remote, most places in Japan have access to a fairly robust kind of options in terms of marketing. But we tested for, I think it was 7 or 8 different options. I can double check that, but yeah.
And do you feel like that in the UK and Europe in general, there's been much talks about transportation problems during coronavirus crisis, borders being locked and drivers, you know, driving hours on end. Was it the same in Japan?
No, so I mean, we had this sort of emergency declared, and people were sort of asked to refrain from going out, try to stay home. But one place that was always packed with people were the grocery stores, and food was flowing. I mean, there was a few times where we had, at least personally, I can say, you know, there were a few times where a shelf may look a little bit empty, but that was really during the kind of first stages, and afterwards we had really no glitch in the system like that at all. It was quite consistent.
That's very interesting. In terms of makes the link between the two, because here in the UK we've witnessed a lot of empty shelves, and curiously, I don't know whether Ludivine, you felt these were imported products that were missing, because a lot of people felt that it was products that we were able to produce on the British soil. How do you feel about it, and what could be the difference between the two countries?
Here, one of the issues, of course, is that some of the imported products were not available, but a big and main issue was that there is a lack of containers, whether it's flour bags, whether it's tins or glass for tins for food or glass for food. And there was really a shortage of these different types of containers, which then impacted on not having flour or seeing fewer products available on the food shelves. And, you know, this is why some supermarkets have started to, you know, they have the flour and they put it in those plastic bags just because it's an easy alternative. It doesn't keep flour very long, but at least it's a solution. So this is why also some supermarkets, as well as those small 1 kilo 500 grams bag, are selling the huge 16 kilos bag that are usually used by companies in the processing world. So it's not as black and white as people think. It's more than just one issue in terms of you know, it's not just that it's imports that were hit. It's also local flour not having sufficient packaging, because these containers often come from abroad, and as soon as the borders were closed, those could not be exported, but also companies felt that they had to keep their national their production national.
Thanks for this very complete answer. I'm just rebounding, like going forward with the idea of cooperative that was mentioned a lot. So we talked about it, and you were saying that for you it was kind of, do you see any other legal or policy mechanism that could be used to increase product marketing and land ownership and management by cooperatives in the UK to go towards to answer the challenges you mentioned about the generations, about the environment, about food supply?
So this is a good question. But I think that even before thinking about policy or legal mechanisms, one of the issues is trust between farmers. And in the UK, this is a key issue that you often don't have in countries like Spain, France, and Italy. And of course, you always have a bit of rivalry, don't get me wrong. But farmers on the continent are more likely to work together and happy to do so in order to be stronger. But here, in the UK, there is a big issue around, you know, rivalry and keeping things hidden from the next door neighbor. And I think this is the main hurdle that needs addressing, you know, in terms of talking to farmers and making them think that, you know, working together would make them stronger against the rest of the agri-food supply chain, which is the first big hurdle. And of course, once actually there is some willingness for the farmers to do that, then this should be reflected in the policy and the legal mechanisms. And this is what, you know, Wales tried to do early on after Brexit, but then decided to backtrack and just say, no, actually at the moment we're going to focus on individual schemes to support farmers rather than thinking about the landscape approach to protecting farming. Again, because the trust isn't there, the willingness to act. There are exceptions, but the majority of farmers is still concerned about what is happening and not sharing.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I wonder, Stephen, if you could shed some light on how it is in Japan, because from what I feel, it's more cooperative there. They have more cooperative social structures in general. Have you found the opposite of that?
Yeah, so I mean, exactly what Ludivine was saying around trust. I mean, when the Teikei movement, the sort of CSA cooperative type of movement started in Japan, it was due to a lack of trust around government kind of declarations around sort of pollutants in milk, and this caused mainly women at home to say, "Yeah, I don't trust this. We're going to go directly to the farmers," and that's what sort of started the whole thing. And I mean, and that was in the '60s, and so now there's been what, 60 years worth of sort of developing these different cooperatives, and they've gone through, and I can it's hard to make really distinct divisions between the kinds of operations farmers run nowadays, because you've got very small box scheme Teikeis, and then you've got larger ones where many farmers are involved, and then there are these ones on the other end of the spectrum, like the Seikyos and of the world, that have massive memberships, and it's all sort of these big logistical sort of operations that farmers can sort of join, but of course they have to be at a certain scale and provide. They're sort of pressured by the same sorts of issues in supply chain that Ludivine was talking about. So there's a big diversity there, but in general, the trend has been, and up until COVID, and I'm really interested to see the long-term effects of COVID on this, but the first generation of Teikei, of cooperatives, really had been in decline in recent years. When you join one of these sort of cooperatives as a consumer, you are part of it. I mean, and you have got every month, it may not be your turn, but there's jobs that you're in charge of. There's organizational tasks you need to do. There's a time and a place every week that you need to gather to receive your vegetables or your food, etc. And so it is very communal, and as mainly the women are the most involved in this processes, and as more women have gone into the workplace and into the workforce, the membership in those first generation Teikeis has gone down. And so many of them now are shifting to these very convenient home delivery systems where, I mean, anything that's in the menu that's offered in these cooperative, selections, you can sort of be rest assured that's going to be okay. It's going to be, they're trying their best to, support the farmer. It's going to be safe and maybe more or less organic. There's a range there as well. But the sort of heavy involvement in the community of the cooperative has sort of been seen as more or less a negative by a lot of the younger people. And so I'm wondering how this, how COVID essentially has affected some of those sort of longer first generation kind of Teikei operations, and seeing if more younger folks want to get involved, especially if, you can work from home. There's more, you're available to show up at a place and more flexible with your time than you would have been otherwise.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how that all plays out, and hopefully we can do another follow-up survey as well. Yeah. Okay, so we're running close on time, but I'm going to get Théo to ask one more question. So I'll leave that to you to pick, Théo, and then we'll close it up.
Right, thanks. My last question will be for you, Stephen, about the generational change that is needed for Japan's agriculture to avoid depopulation of rural areas. But how do you feel like young people are keen? You have people keen in Japan to start farming, like we can witness here. We can witness it here in the UK.
Yeah. So in general, the general trend is that many young people, of course, are not interested, but very slight upticks in recent years. And I have to say, I've done research on, for example, the support system the government offers for young farmers, for new farmers. It's quite generous in comparison. I think, I don't know with other countries, but we did a comparison with the US, and you can receive training to become a new farmer for free, for and actually receive essentially a monthly stipend to sort of buffer your operation, you know, as you first start up and don't really know what you're doing. But that's offered for a maximum of about 7 years. And so you can sort of, as a kind of potential job for young people, they've put out, you know, there's many support structures available for people to sort of link into. And of course, I think there was a question also about how young people, if they're available, if they're able to sort of work cooperatively with older farmers or other more established farmers. Yeah, there are many sort of shadow programs, you know, and matchmaking programs where if you are a young person interested in farming, they'll work very hard to try to match you with the right kind of farmer, with the right kind of farming, with land, with equipment, very, very low interest loans. So all those kinds of options are on the table. And so my big interest here in what might happen after COVID is if sort of lifestyles, they don't have to be, you know, full-time farmers, even part-time sort of more self-sufficient, sort of self-sufficiency oriented folks, if they move in greater numbers to rural places. There's been sort of waves of in-migration throughout the history of Japan, and this may, you know, be the sort of beginnings of one of these next, another wave. I would hope that that's the case. Yeah.
Right.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Stephen. That was really interesting. So we've only got 2 minutes left, so I think we'll wrap up. But thank you for Stephen. It's about 9 o'clock there now, I think. So 9 o'clock in the evening. So thanks very much for joining us and taking the time out. And thank you also to Ludivine. Hopefully we can work with you a bit more closely in the future as well.
I would be lovely,
yeah, great. And I don't know if you guys are happy for anyone to send on questions. I think Ben, who's in Kyoto, has some more questions for you, Stephen. So that'd be great. Brilliant. Thank you.
Ben. Yes, I'll get to those. Yeah, but
I have some more as well.
No problem. Send over questions. That's great.
Brilliant. Thank you. So thank you both to our speakers. They've been really interesting presentations, and also just really interesting to do a bit of a cross comparison between the UK and Japan. So thanks to everyone, and hopefully that was an interesting lunchtime, and we'll see you hopefully next week for our fourth webinar, which we'll post details online of soon if they're not already. And this will be put up on YouTube if you want to watch back or you want to share with any colleagues. So thanks very much, everyone. Take care.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye.
Good night.